Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. Good evening from Paris, France. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Munir Beltaifa, and I'm the Vice President of Initiatives of Change International. It is an honor to welcome you to this crucial conference towards justice and peace in the Middle East. It is hosted by Initiatives of Change International, a global movement which for almost 100 years has sought to build trust across the world's divides, from healing the wounds of the past and fostering peace and reconciliation to promoting ethical business and integrity in public life. I'm privileged to be here with all of you today as we gather to address one of the most enduring and contentious issues of our time. In times where global wealth increases, should we citizens of the world accept any justification of killing hundreds of thousands of civilians in Europe, Middle East, and elsewhere? Recent wars haven't led to peace. Too many hearts around the world are bleeding, and humanity needs more efficient diplomacy, moral rearmament, and better use of taxpayers' money through more honest conversations than use of military weapons. We are fortunate to have with us a panel of distinguished speakers who will provide us with invaluable insights and perspectives. First, Dr. Peter Shambrook will present his talk, Policy of Deceit, Britain's Role in Fomenting a Century of Conflict in Palestine, which will delve into historical policies and their long-lasting impacts on the region. Following him, Sir Vincent Fien will explore how can Britain and the West better contribute to peace and justice between Israel and Palestine. His discussion will be crucial in understanding the role that Western nations can and should play in fostering peace and justice. Lastly, Dr. Alan Leal will share his vision in A Path Towards a Lasting Peace Between Palestinians and Israelis. He will outline actionable steps towards achieving a sustainable and enduring peace in the region. Our discussions today are particularly timely, given the recent recognition of the State of Palestine by Ireland, Norway, and Spain. This significant development underscores the growing international acknowledgement of the need for justice and peace. In the face of ongoing humanitarian crisis and the devastation in Palestine, it is imperative that we challenge the narrative of denial and address the grave injustices occurring under the pretext of self-defense. The voices calling for justice and peace are more essential now than ever. As we embark on this dialogue, let us commit ourselves to the principles of justice, empathy, and a steadfast dedication to peace. Let us amplify the voices demanding change and work collectively towards a future where dignity, security, and harmony prevail for all. It is now my pleasure to hand over to our esteemed moderator, my dear colleague, Dr. Maria del Pilar Griffin, member of Initiatives of Change International Council, joining from Seattle, Washington, USA, who will guide us through today's honest conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beltaifa. It is a pleasure to be here today serving as a moderator of this meaningful event. I would like to review a little bit of the objectives. Why are we here today? The main objective of the Towards Justice and Peace in the Middle East Conference is to foster a comprehensive and informed dialogue on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The conference also aims to illuminate historical context, providing a detailed understanding of the historical events and policies, particularly focusing on Britain's role in the century-long conflict in Palestine, to shed light on the root causes of the ongoing crisis. To assess Western contributions by critically evaluating how Britain and other Western nations can effectively contribute to peace and justice in the region, moving towards proactive and positive involvement. To propose paths to peace, explore and propose strategies and frameworks for achieving a sustainable and lasting peace between Palestinians and Israelis, considering contemporary geopolitical dynamics, and recent international recognitions of the Palestinian state. We want to amplify voices for justice. This is an opportunity to highlight and to amplify the voices advocating for justice, for human rights, and humanitarian relief in Palestine, challenging narratives that perpetuate violence and oppression. And finally, for this session, we want to foster collaborative solutions, create a platform of the diverse stakeholders, including policymakers, scholars, activists, and community leaders, to collaborate and develop innovative solutions that promote justice, reconciliation, and peace in the Middle East. With these aims, we welcome our first speaker, Dr. Peter Shambrook. He is he's British and holds a PhD in modern Middle Eastern history from Cambridge University and has held several research positions, including at Durham University and the Center of Lebanese Studies in Oxford. He is the historical consultant of the Balfour Project and the author of the French Imperialism in Syria from 1927-1936. The Times Literary Supplement describes Peter Shambrook's book, Policy of Deceit, as a forensic, fair-minded exposure of how the British government broke its promises to people of Palestine. I will hand over to Dr. Shambrook, who will talk about Policy of Deceit, Britain's role in fomenting a century of conflict in Palestine. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. The British started the 100-year war for the control of Palestine. The Palestinians are engaged in an anti-colonial struggle. Countries like the US, Canada, Australia, South Africa, all have their roots in European settler colonialism. They are all, for one reason or another, in a post-colonial phase. Israel is still in the colonizing phase, and it's an extremely brutal one. British forces occupied Ottoman Palestine in 1918 and stayed for 30 troubled years. During the First World War, we first promised the Ottoman Palestine region to the French in early 1915, and then to the Arabs in the person of Sharif Hussein of Mecca in October 1915. And then 2 years later, we promised the same region of Palestine to the global Jewish community. After the war, for our own imperial reasons, we reneged on our promise to the Arabs and fulfilled our promise to the Zionist organization. The British Mandate document, ratified by the League of Nations in July 1922, contained a fundamental contradiction in that it advocated both the establishment of a Jewish national home and, at the same time, instructed the mandatory power, Britain, to prepare Palestine for self-government. However, from the start, Lord George's pro-Zionist government instituted a one-sided Crown colony administration, which was fundamentally anti-Arab. Crucially, the British withheld any constitutional reform or development. This deliberate withholding of representative institutions policy was never explained to the Palestinian Arabs. Instead, for 2 decades, they were on the receiving end of misleading, reassuring statements by successive British governments about their rights, including their political rights, quite deceitful. In the mid-1930s, two factors exploded onto the Palestinian scene. One was the tremendous increase of Jewish immigrants into Palestine who were fleeing Nazi persecution, and this fundamentally changed the demographic balance between the Jewish and Arab communities. In 1935, some 62,000 Jews arrived in Palestine. The second factor to explode onto the Palestinian scene was the Palestinian Arab Revolt, which started in 1936, precipitated largely by the British steadfast refusal for the previous 15 years to allow any constitutional development at all in Palestine. And this, in spite of a series of Palestinian delegations to London, numerous petitions, and peaceful demonstrations, and the British total refusal to limit Jewish immigration. Palestinians became increasingly fearful of being swamped. In order to suppress the Palestinian revolt, the British passed emergency regulations which legalized mass arrests, curfews, house demolitions, and military courts. By the summer of 1939, the revolt had been brutally suppressed, the Palestinian people disarmed, their leaders exiled or executed. 108 Palestinians were hung between 1937 and 1939. And Jewish militias armed and trained by the British. In 1948, the British government, exhausted by the war, washed its hands, like Pontius Pilate, of the Palestine problem. It withdrew and allowed Zionist militias, in effect, to mount a coup and to drive a majority of Palestinians out of Palestine. This was the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the Nakba, and the establishment of the State of Israel. In 1948, the indigenous Palestinian Arabs still constituted a solid majority, some 68% of the population, and still owned 93% of the land of mandatory Palestine. The Jewish community, now some 32% of the population, and largely European and urban, owned, and this after 60 years of colonization, some 7% of Palestine. In 1948, Ben-Gurion's Zionist militias created the State of Israel on 78% of Palestine. No British government has ever expressed one iota of responsibility for what happened in 1948. And since 1967, a succession of governments in London have kept their eyes firmly fixed on the next election, on trade, including the arms trade, on oil security, and on the so-called special relationship with Washington, D.C. The US, the UK, Europe, and Israel speak about international law, but take little, if any, notice of it. This is not currently a conventional war. It is an ethnic cleansing operation, an opportunity seized by Israel following the Hamas terror of the 7th of October. And it was horrific and absolutely terrorist. It was a kind of prison breakout. It will not destroy Hamas, although the asymmetry in power between the Hamas fighters and the IDF is monumental. At the same time, Israel's current rhetoric is that of the slave master. The slave master. Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, refers to the enemy as human animals and used this view to justify the inhumane siege that he imposed, the cutting off of water, food, fuel, and medical supplies to 2.3 million people, dehumanizing an entire people. No thought is spared for Palestinian security, let alone Palestinian rights. Now, Gaza. In the course of the 1948 war, more than 200,000 Palestinian refugees were added to Gaza's population of around 70,000, thus creating a massive humanitarian problem. UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, was set up to provide food, education, and health services to the refugees. In June 1967, Israel occupied the Gaza Strip and turned this tiny enclave into an open-air prison. The reality is that between 1967 and 2005, a classic colonial situation prevailed in the Gaza Strip. A few thousand Israeli settlers, colonists, settlers, controlled 25% of the territory, 40% of the arable land, and the largest share of the desperately short or scarce water resources of the Strip. Economic progress for the Palestinians was thwarted by a deliberate strategy, Israeli strategy, of economic, social, and political de-development. The overriding Israeli consideration behind the Israeli withdrawal in 2005 was to divert resources from Gaza in order to safeguard and consolidate the more significant Israeli settlements in the West Bank. In the year after withdrawing its 8,000 settlers from Gaza, the Likud government introduced 12,000 settlers, new settlers, into the West Bank. And now, as we all know, there are over 750,000 settlers in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Israel refused to recognize the democratically elected Hamas government of 2006 and turned down its offer of negotiations. The US and the EU followed Israel's lead and joined it in measures of economic warfare designed to undermine it. Hamas then prevented or preempted a Fatah coup with a violent, and it was very violent, seizure of power in Gaza in June 2007. And at this point, the Palestinian national movement became fractured, with Fatah ruling the West Bank and Hamas ruling the Gaza Strip. The stated purpose of this subsequent Israeli blockade was to stop the transfer of weapons and military equipment to Hamas, but it also restricted the flow of food, fuel, and medical supplies to the civilian population. The hidden motive was to cripple Gaza's economy and to inflict poverty, misery, and unemployment on its inhabitants, a form of collective punishment that is clearly prescribed by international law. over 2 million Palestinians in Gaza have basically been hostages since 2007. In December 2008, Israel launched Operation Cast Lead in breach of a 6-month ceasefire which Egypt had brokered. In all, 1,417 Gazans were killed at that point, including 313 children and more than 5,500 wounded. 83% of the casualties were civilians. It was really a one-sided massacre. Operation Cast Lead was followed by further Israeli attacks on the Gaza Strip in 2012, 14, 21, 22, and 23. Operation Swords of Iron is the 6th Israeli military offensive in Gaza in 15 years. And it is by far the most lethal and destructive. Israeli generals frequently use the same phrase to describe their recurrent operations in Gaza. It's called mowing the lawn. What this means is that they have no military solution to the problem of Gaza. So every few years, they move in with foot soldiers, tanks, artillery, navy, and aircraft, smash up the place, degrade the military capabilities of Hamas, pulverize the civilian infrastructure, and then go home and leave the political problem completely unresolved. Hamas is indeed a terrorist organization, but not a terrorist organization pure and simple, as Israel and its Western allies, including the British, the UK government, keep insisting. It is a political party with a military wing whose attacks on civilians constitute terrorist acts. It is also a mass social movement. It is the failure of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, and the PA to achieve freedom and statehood that largely explains Hamas's growing influence. The 3 pillars of Judaism are truth, justice, and peace. The essence of Judaism is compassion for the neighbor, the brother, the other. By its policies, the current extremist government, Israeli government, has buried those pillars and essence of 5,000 years of Jewish history. To conclude, eventually there will have to be meaningful negotiations towards a resolution of this brutal, seemingly intractable 100-year war. That would take statesmanship, of which at present there is no sign whatsoever, and the negotiations would require the inclusion of all parties, as well as all the Israeli hostages that must be freed, that should be freed. So should thousands of Palestinian prisoners, women, children, men, many of whom have been incarcerated for years without trial. Ultimately, this is not a conflict between two equal sides, but between an extremely powerful colonizing government and a subjugated people who have almost no military, economic, or diplomatic power or influence, but who refuse to surrender and who refuse to be erased from history. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shambrook. Understanding this history is crucial for any meaningful discussion on the path to peace and justice in the region. Now we will move to a 10 minutes time for questions and answers. Due to the large amount of questions submitted, usually it will be 3 questions that will be selected to be addressed during this time. The first question comes from Fatima from the United Arab Emirates. What response are you getting from your book, Policy of Deceit?
Well, that I wasn't expecting that question. On the whole, I'm getting a very positive response, and the book is selling well. It's a semi sort of academic book, so it's reasonably expensive, but because it's been selling well, the publisher is going to bring out a paperback version and an audio version as well. So the paperback version comes out in July. There's my plug for the book, paperback version. But on the whole, the feedback has been very positive, and I think people appreciate something which is dispassionate and which is based on evidence. My book is based on evidence. I was in the archives, in and out of the British archives, as well as lots of other places, for the last 7 years. And so my book is based on a combination of documents that I found in the Colonial Office, Foreign Office, Cabinet Office documents that I found in the National Archives in Kew in West London. I took 10,000 photos of 10,000 documents of relevant documents, British documents. So I had those in one hand, and in the other hand, I had the Hansard online records of all the parliamentary discussions in the House of Commons and the House of Lords between 1914 and 1939. I went through every single day of parliamentary records during that period and pulled out and printed and compared these records. It was 1.4 million words of Hansard records with what the policymakers were saying among themselves privately. So my book is based on evidence, and I must say, endeavoring to find the truth out of all of that has been a huge bit of detective work. But no, a lot of people have said the publication of my book was very, very timely. Of course, I had no idea for 7 years that October the 7th would happen just a couple of months after the publication of my book. So, as I say, a lot of people have said it was very, very timely, and I've not really had any negative blowback from my book as yet, but of course that may happen.
Thank you. Thanks. We have a lot of people asking questions. So here we go with Niti Nesadurai from Malaysia. She asked, why is it after all these years, evidence and facts, the US, UK, Germany, Canada, and Australia, and questioning support Israel, irrespective of the ongoing atrocities against the Palestinians, a funding which is not even reciprocated and makes these countries complicit of these atrocities? Why?
That's a huge question, but basically, I would say the great power narrative, the so-called international community, the US and the West and the UK generally, together with Israel, have their imperial and I would say pro-Israeli or pro-Zionist narrative has dominated the airwaves and the media and the literature ever since the Second World War, and that goes back to a whole series of factors. including, of course, the Western deep sense of guilt, and rightly so, of the Holocaust and everything else like that. So that's basically what it is. It's the dominant Zionist, pro-Zionist narrative has dominated the airwaves until about 20 years ago. It's beginning to change now, thank goodness, with a combination of the advent of social media and lots of other things. But there's still a long way to go. Most British people know very little about the British background to the actual truth of the British background to Palestine and Israel, or indeed to our empire generally. So that's one of the points that the Balfour Project is endeavoring to do, is to educate the British in particular about and to acknowledge. We need to acknowledge our past history, basically. And my book in some ways is my own personal expression of acknowledgement. In terms of building the future, building peace in the future, I rely on the 3 A's: acknowledgement, and then accountability, and then acceptance. Acceptance in a sense that whatever happens in a conflict resolution, we ultimately have to build a safe, secure future for all sides. However, for a post-imperial power like the British, we need to, I believe, start with ourselves and acknowledge honestly, not cheap apologies, but honestly acknowledge our own past. And that's what I've tried to do in my book. And I think that is a first step that is required. In general, I'd say it's required, before you can have pragmatic justice, before you can have reconciliation or anything else like that. Without acknowledgement, there is no modicum of trust. And there has to be some modicum of trust before you can have meaningful negotiations and conflict, beginnings of progress towards conflict resolution.
Thank you. We have one more question, and maybe in like 3 more minutes to answer that question. Could you address the issue of the 800,000 Jews expelled from Middle Eastern countries after the State of Israel was created in 1947? These expulsions are frequently cited as a cause of the subsequent NABCA. Apparently, also, these expelled Jews people were not Western Jews, but Jews of North Africa and Middle Western origin. So we are also told that the current population of Israel is not a majority white or Western population. Thanks for letting us know whether these facts are correct.
Well, the exodus of Jews from North Africa and places like Baghdad in Iraq came after the Holocaust, came after the creation of the State of Israel in May 1948. We take just one example. In Iraq, in Baghdad alone, there was an indigenous Jewish community of about 125,000 Jews. 125,000 Jews. And between 1948, but particularly from about 1950, the first 50 to 55, well over 100,000 of those Jews were left Baghdad for a variety of reasons. So there is no, and there should be no sort of equivalence between the fact that 750,000 Palestinians were kicked out for military reasons, expulsions and so on, in 1948, the spring and summer of 1948, by the Zionist militias, and the 800,000 Jews who eventually reached Israel in subsequent years. I would suggest, if anyone is interested in that whole 800,000 Exodus issue, that you read Avi Schleim's book, his autobiography called Three Worlds, The Memoirs of an Arab Jew. He came from a distinguished Arab Jewish Baghdadi family, and he was born in Baghdad, and then when he was 5 or 6, his family moved to Israel, and he grew up in Israel. And that is an absolutely fascinating book dealing with that whole issue. It's called Three Worlds by Professor Avi Schleim. So that's, yes, I'll stop there. I don't want to keep blathering on.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we wrapped your session with 3 words: acknowledgement, accountability, and acceptance. And with those 3 words, we move to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Sir Vincent Finn. He is a retired British diplomat and former ambassador. He served as High Commissioner to Malta from 2002 to 2006, Ambassador to Libya from 2006 to 2010, and Consul General Jerusalem, de facto ambassador to the occupied Palestinian territories from 2010 to 2014. After retirement, he chaired the Balfour Project, which works to advance equal rights for all in Palestine, Israel. In recent years, he has spoken and written extensively in the British media on how Britain could help towards a lasting peace between Israel and Palestine. Sir Vincent Finn will explore how Britain and the West can better contribute to peace and justice between Israel and Palestine. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Pilar. And thank you, Munir, for the introduction today. Thank you to Peter for his exposition on our history, the British history. Today, I'll be speaking for myself rather than for the Balfour Project, because that gives me slightly more latitude to speak freely. But I commend to all of our participants today, to all of our viewers, the Balfour Project conference, which comes off on the 6th of June, Thursday of next week, called Peace with Justice, How to Get There. And Alina has very kindly put into the chat some details about that. It's an in-person conference in London, but also online and free online for those not in London that day. And the Balfour Project website, www.balfourproject.org, is another source of the same information. In there, in the flyer and actually at the conference, we'll be addressing some action points for the British government, which also apply to Western governments, other Western governments as a whole. What's needed today? There needs to be a permanent ceasefire in Gaza and Israel, the release of the hostages criminally held by Hamas, and a vast influx of aid into Gaza, led by UNRWA, the UN Relief Works Agency, to combat starvation, because famine and starvation are prevalent in Gaza today. The UK should stop its arms transfers to Israel, whose government, in my opinion, is conducting a war in Gaza indiscriminately and disproportionately, to use a legal term. Israel is flouting the International Court of Justice interim measures introduced on the 26th of January and more recently renewed and reinforced by the ICJ. Now, it's not for me, as a child of post-imperial Britain, to tell anyone in the region how to conduct themselves, how to live their lives in some given political framework. I've got no right to do that, not least at all with regard to the Palestinian people, whom my country and my government has undermined and undercut for a century. So a degree of humility is needed. Nor should I be telling Israelis like Alon what to do or how to vote. Israel is a fact and will remain. But what I can do as a British voter is to tell our next British government on the 4th of July what we think it should do about this conflict of unequals. The UK should uphold international law. We can ask our elected representatives, our MPs, to seek equality, equal rights as a principle in our foreign policy. My question today is whether out of this tragedy, and Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank are in a tragic situation, can come some hope of peaceful coexistence between Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs, at a time when our Western leaders often say 2 states, adding an irreversible path towards that outcome, and dangle the prospect of recognition of the state of Palestine alongside Israel on pre-June 1967 lines, before the military occupation of 1967. And just this week, as I'm sure Alon will mention, Spain, Norway, and Ireland have made that prospect of recognition a reality. I congratulate them. And Slovenia is on the same path. I'll spend more time on UK and Western policy towards Israel than towards Palestine, because Israel has the power. Israel is the occupying power in Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the rest of the West Bank, that entity which I call Palestine. There are no saints and no heroes in this tragedy, other than perhaps the innocent civilians and people on both sides. And what Hamas did, as Peter said, on the 7th of October was appalling and wrong. I don't need to address the history. Peter has done so, explaining Britain's relevance and responsibilities, and indeed our duplicity and deceit. Instead, I'll try to say why now, 10 years on from the 2-state solution being parked after the Kerry effort, it's back on the road, or at least being talked about. And I'll try to say, are there realistic alternatives to 2 states other than the status quo before 7 October? And what would it take to make 2 states real? I'll touch on the recognition of Palestine by the UK, which the Balfour Project advocates, consequences for law breaking by whoever breaks the law, and Israeli impunity. It seems to be above the law. Will that persist? Who might do the heavy lifting required to achieve peace with justice? And is it worth the effort? I think it is. Ever since the period that Peter Shambrook covered, and as he mentioned, Britain has got into the habit of deference to the US. We have been waiting for the US for decades, and we still have that tendency. Today, as we know, the US and the UK are being accused of complicity in Israeli war crimes in Gaza. Today, Presidents Biden and Macron of France are talking about 2 states after that 10-year pause. US Secretary of State John Kerry in 2013-14, when I was in Jerusalem, made the last real effort to address the 2-state solution, and he failed. Today, our Foreign Minister, Foreign Secretary David Cameron is saying rather unusual things. For example, that the Israeli policy of the last 30 years has failed. By that he means security, safety for the people of Israel, the first duty of any government. And he implied that Benjamin Netanyahu embodies that failed policy. The promise made by the Israeli government that the Israeli armed forces can protect Israelis and they don't really need to bother about Palestinians. That's been proved wrong. The West, including the UK, sees a need to offer hope to Palestinians of a better future, not under occupation, a better life than sumud or resilience, armed resistance or peaceful resistance, or migration. And crucially, genuine safety for Israelis. So how does that come about? I would say through mutual security, not domination by one people of another. I think we already know domination doesn't work. I accept that we're a long way from an outcome, and none of this is easy, but that doesn't stop us thinking about and planning for and working for an end to the occupation, and doesn't stop us advocating it, with the British government playing a positive role to achieve it. What we don't want to see is the occupation prolonged, perpetuated by another name. And I think Alon will be saying later, the two parties, Israelis and Palestinians, need help. They cannot solve this crisis, this ongoing crisis, on their own. What does ending the occupation mean? It means Palestinian self-determination, with all that that entails, consistent with international law. The Palestinian people have that right, do have that right, and nobody can take it away. Ending the occupation would mean Palestinian control over the Palestinian National Register of births, marriages, deaths, currently controlled by Israel. It would mean Palestinians policing Palestinians, Palestinians judging Palestinians, not Israelis doing those things. Palestinian control of customs and excise, of access, borders, water, natural resources, air and sea access to the country, access between Gaza and the West Bank, all on the basis of mutual security, equal security for both peoples, with international guarantees to safeguard that. Are there alternatives? Yes, there is the status quo ante, where we were on the 6th of October last year. Some call it a one-state reality of inequality. That was a terrible place for Palestinians and not a safe place for Israelis. I fear that Mr. Netanyahu wants to go back there, or worse. There is the one-state solution, secular, equal, it has logic, but is it attainable? It isn't where the international community is now. It isn't where the Jewish majority in the population of Israel is, or is likely ever to be. Are two states realistic? They are not a triumph of hope over experience, because we have not had the experience. Two states have never been tried. In my opinion, Israel has never wanted two states. Successive Israeli governments have done much to prevent them, not least the settlement project. If there were to be two states, what would need to be addressed to get there? The final or permanent status issues were essentially ducked and pushed back by the Oslo Accords of the 1990s. But those real issues are the status of Jerusalem, defining borders, what to do about the illegal settlements in East Jerusalem and the rest of the West Bank, security, refugees, and relations with neighbors. These are very familiar issues, often debated. Solving them, addressing them, would require concessions, not only by Israel, but mainly by Israel as the occupying power. They have the land. Today, the logic of Biden and Macron is to revisit them. I hope they mean it, and I hope they mean it on the basis of international law. So what's changed to bring this subject back to the table? I believe Israel has gone too far, to put it mildly. Its friends in the West are uncomfortable, as they should be. Well, before the 7th of October, Israel was in breach of international law through the Gaza blockade from 2007, through the illegal settlement project, and its conduct of the occupation, the repressive conduct of the occupation. Today, we have Israeli government ministers, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, inciting settler violence. And since 7 October, in my opinion, Israel has resorted to starvation and famine as a weapon of war. It has locked down the West Bank, where the incitement to violent settlers is rife, backed by Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. So what about international law? The ICJ, the International Court of Justice, is busy determining whether Israel is guilty of genocide, and separately advising whether the 1967 occupation is illegal. The word genocide will hang round Israel's neck like an albatross for years to come, as the ICJ deliberates. As to the advisory opinion, which is forthcoming, maybe in July, on the legality of the occupation, I'd like to quote from one of my favorite British lawyers, the distinguished lawyer Philippe Sands, who happens to be Jewish, and who addressed the court about the occupation as follows, and I quote, I'll read it out. The purpose and effect of the occupation is the denial of the right of self-determination and the prevention of the solution called for by the Security Council, the UN General Assembly, and the vast majority of states of our world, premised on the existence of the two-state solution. The occupation is illegal and must be brought to an immediate, unconditional, and total end. The right of self-determination requires that UN member states, that includes the UK, should bring Israel's occupation to an immediate end. No aid, no assistance, no complicity, no contribution to forcible actions, no money, no arms, no trade, no nothing. All UN member states are obliged by law to end Israel's presence on the territory of Palestine. That is what international law requires, no more and no less. Unquote. If only international law had leverage, had teeth. It has teeth when states choose to give it teeth. What would it take to make Philippe Sands' vision anything like a reality? Quite a lot. International cohesion, agreement on this irreversible outcome of two states that Biden and Macron and Cameron talk about. Consequences for law breaking, whoever commits the breaking of the law. Upholding international law with a role for the ICC. Palestinian democratic renewal, much needed. Absorbing all tendencies into something bigger and other, and I would argue, non-violent. A change of mindset in Israel, a big ask, as my friend Alon can testify. May I say I'm honored to be on the same platform as Peter and Alon. They are people of honor. The legal apparatus, the ICJ and the ICC, are certainly of interest, but ultimately politics and associated diplomacy will be decisive. I'd like to start with a change of mindset here in London. On that issue, British diplomacy at the political level has woken up a bit after all the navel-gazing about Brexit in 2016. David Cameron's arrival, maybe short-term, but arrival, has woken up for UK foreign policy to a certain extent. Better late than never. But the expectation is here that we will have a Labour government in Britain from the 4th of July. There is urgency. Trump is on the horizon, and he does not represent the 7th Cavalry. Biden is better, but not yet great, though his intervention yesterday was positive. We can maybe talk about that in Q&A. The United States is Israel's best friend, has Israel's back, is essential to any outcome, but is not enough on its own. Back to Britain, Keir Starmer, the Labour leader here, is excessively risk-averse on this subject. He will need courage in government and a US partner, not a maverick who tweets too much. Meanwhile, Britain's standing in the global south, with the global south, is low and getting lower. Our government tied itself to the Israeli war machine in October and has yet to free itself. But the UK still has convening power, has its place with France as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and there are things we can and should do. What we ought not to do is to pontificate about international law without meaning it. We need a plan which recognizes Palestinian agency alongside Israel in any solution for Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the rest of the West Bank. A plan which recognizes that Israelis have full rights, but that those rights stop at the green line, where Palestinian rights take over. I mean by the green line, the pre-June 1967 borders before the military occupation. We need to save UNRWA, the UN Relief Works Agency, not kick it. I very much hope that our next government will renew funding for UNRWA and will advocate for UNRWA, which is uniquely well placed to deliver what's needed in Gaza now. Recognition of Palestine as a state on those pre-June 67 lines, albeit under occupation today, should be part of that plan. Our history, British history, carries with it a responsibility to give a lead here, going further than nice words. So far, we've had nice words. It all comes back to self-determination for two peoples. One people has achieved it. We can acknowledge the rights of the other people, equal people, by recognizing the state of Palestine. It means parity of esteem for both peoples. It's not enough on its own, but it's a start. A much needed change of mindset here in London. The elements of a plan are well known. What's needed is the will and the cohesion of the international community to deliver, and to say that there are consequences for maintaining inequality. Peter used a word too little used by governments: accountability. There are two peoples whose security needs to be safeguarded, not just one. And to achieve equality and equal treatment by us of both peoples, that sustained effort will need to be undertaken with or without the US. I want it with, plus the rest of the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, the European Union, Israel, and the PLO, or whatever leadership Palestinians choose. I repeat, it's for Palestinians, not for me, to choose their leadership. Engagement will be needed from Arab near neighbors, Egypt, Jordan, and from the Gulf states, with the UK playing a full part, not a bit part. Is it worth the effort? And I'll end here. Yes, you can try to ignore or forget Israel-Palestine, but it won't let you. This conflict has a malign capacity to hurt and divide, not only in the region, but here at home as well. We've seen that in the manifestations of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, which have grown. Better to address the root causes than to be complicit in prolonging inequality, violence, and discrimination. I'll end by saying a word more about our conference on the 6th of June, Peace with Justice, How to Get There. We will have good speakers. We're working closely with the History Department of King's College London. The venue for those who can be there, is Bush House on the Strand in central London. The time is 2 p.m. UK time. We'd like you to be there, either face-to-face or on Zoom, as today. One of our keynote speakers is Agnes Kamala, the head of Amnesty International. She will speak her mind on the need for respect for international law for the good of us all. She is right. There will be no solution in Israel-Palestine unless the law prevails and is respected by all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Vincent. Indeed, Britain and the West have a huge responsibility, but I think that the basic step here is to acknowledge and respect international law. With that thought, we are going now to receive the questions. We have 10 minutes for questions. And I'm going to combine a couple of questions here because you already addressed them. But also many people are asking, how can they help us individuals? And the other one is, do you think, well, it's the one that you already responded, but do you think that the two-state solution is the solution? But briefly, we can talk about how do people help us individuals?
Yep. Okay. In our country, in the UK, where I am, we have an election, which is a turning point. 14 years of rule by one government, and now the option of change. Depends on the British people which way it goes. What I would like is for British people on this call to think about engaging with their candidates in the next 5 weeks to make the point that for us on this call, the question of equality between Israelis and Palestinians matters, and that Britain has a role to play. We have hidden behind the US in the past, and it isn't a dignified or valid position to be. So for the British, the idea of interrogating, questioning our candidates, making it clear that for us, the question of equal rights and law is crucial, fundamental, and may determine how we vote, and then quizzing our candidates to get their response. That's the UK short-term opportunity. For colleagues around the world, it's a bit similar, making your voice heard at the level of government, starting with your own government, but also the key players. And who are the key players? Ultimately Israel, because Israel has the power, as the occupying power. The Palestinians don't have power. They have rights, but the rights have not been afforded to them. They have not been able to do that. So if we're talking about Malaysia, if we're talking about Turkey, if we're talking about Canada, lobbying, pressing the government of the country to make a priority of respect for international law. And the reason why that matters, and you said it already, Pilar, is that for all of us, having a framework of law that means that if we get things right, we're safe. If we do things wrong, we face a penalty. It is the way of civilization. And if international law is applied selectively, it's as good as it not having it at all. So making a point that international law is not an academic privilege, it's not an academic subject, but it is truly a safeguard for all of us. And the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights is the foundation of civilized relations between states, between peoples. Those things matter. And saying that to our governments, who can be very expedient and can live for the day, again, as Peter said, for the next election, and subordinate the law to short-term interests like trade or political advantage, trying to get that back up the agenda and get it to be a precept that is respected by all governments. It's a big ask. and it depends where you are, whether that's achievable or not. But it's a good aspiration. I'm pretty sure it's an aspiration that the Initiatives of Change advocates.
Thank you. Now, what means should Palestinians employ to attain self-determination?
What means?
Yes.
Okay. Right. I'll try also to address briefly the question I forgot, which is about is the two-state solution possible? But let me start with the means. I'm a believer in nonviolence. I believe that the right way to get your way is by persuasion and by, if necessary, peaceful resistance. This occupation has lasted too long. Since 1967, 57 years. I do believe that the International Court of Justice next month is likely to advise that it's illegal, and that should be a clarion call to governments around the world to agree and to act accordingly. What should the Palestinians do? They have been deprived of many opportunities to protest peacefully. That is the method of the occupation, is to suppress. So what are the alternatives? Advocacy is one. Speaking out on public fora, on social media, to the world. And that's happening. That's happening. The 47 million people who have watched Keep Your Eyes on Rafah is an indication of the power of social media. So getting the message out from Gaza, from the West Bank to the world is important. We try in our small way in the Balfour Project to do so. At our 6th June conference, we have a political activist and commentator from Ramallah, Noor Odeh, who will be speaking. I do not believe that the Palestinian cause is best served by violence. They have rights. They have rights that have been withheld. The argument is clear. The argument is made more obscure by violence. On the question of two states, here I'll be brief, but to say, I don't like the status quo. I'm not sure who does like the status quo, except maybe Netanyahu, Smotrich, and Ben-Gvir, but they are not my favorites. I don't like the status quo, and I don't want us to go back to the status quo of 6 October. I want Gaza and the West Bank to be united politically, economically, and in every other way. And I want freedom for both peoples. Can the two-state solution happen? Let's be honest, successive Israeli governments have worked very hard to prevent it, with the settlement enterprise and currently with the destruction of hospitals, schools, and universities in Gaza and housing. Can it be done? I think it can. I don't know if it will. I want it to. But the fundamental point is self-determination for the people of Palestine. In the end, Israelis and Palestinians will choose. I want the outcome to be a choice that leads to equality, not discrimination, because I don't believe that permanent oppression of one people by another either is good or works.
Thanks. We have a lot of questions here that we would like to address, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end of the session that we will have a general conversation. But we have 3 more minutes, and I will take Ramsey from Brussels is asking, what is the view of the speakers regarding the proposal by Israel announced by USA President Biden yesterday? Are you aware of that?
Yes, I'm aware of the media reports. I don't have any insight other than that. I think President Biden needs to end this war for his own good. which is a fundamental point. I would prefer him to succeed in the elections in November in the US, particularly on this subject of Israel-Palestine, because Mr. Trump was effectively an estate agent for Netanyahu in his 4 years in office. And I don't need that again. Neither do the Palestinians. And frankly, the world is a safer place without Trump in office. So Biden, who is losing the youth and losing Arabs and losing some of the minorities in the United States at the moment because of Gaza, needs to do better while preserving a relationship with Israel, which is probably the US's closest ally. The proposal yesterday from Biden entailed a 6-week ceasefire. And let's not forget that thousands of people, probably hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza are starving now. And Israel, whatever it says, is not letting enough food aid and other aid in. That needs to change. The ceasefire could do that. Hostage release is clearly a priority for all of us, and that is part of the package. Just to introduce one note of caution, this morning, Mr. Netanyahu said Israel will continue to work, to fight, to eliminate Hamas and to eliminate its capacity to attack Israel. There is daylight between Netanyahu and Biden. I would like that daylight to disappear and the gap to be closed. I would like Israel to endorse what Biden said, and I would like Hamas to do the same.
Let's hope. Let's pray. Thank you. Now we move to our last speaker for this session, and we move from history through the challenge of the role of the Western governments and countries, and now we are going to reflect about paths to peace. I will hand the word to our speaker, Dr. Alan Lill, and he will share his vision, path towards a lasting peace between Palestinians and Israelis. Dr. Alan Lill is a former Director General of the Foreign Ministry of Israel and was also Israel's ambassador to South Africa. In 2014, he was an instigator of a campaign by Israeli academics and former diplomats to encourage European governments to recognize Palestine as a sovereign state, and has since worked assiduously for this recognition as a step towards justice and peace between Israel and Palestine. Welcome to the floor, Dr. Lill.
Thank you very much. I did not intend to spend time on history, but since my good friend, dear friend Peter, described me and my parents and my children as colonialists, I want to tell you a little bit, especially about my parents. Both my parents were born in Germany. My father in 1919. His family had no intention to go to Israel. In 1935, when they saw the troubles in the pipeline, his parents told my father that they want to go to Palestine. He refused. He refused. They were living in a city in the Schwarzwald in South Germany, in Pforzheim. He was a good student. He liked the nature there. In one of the years, he was chosen as the best student in class the habit was to give the best student the Hitler book, Mein Kampf. But as he was Jewish, they gave him a watch. He ran to the mountains. He escaped. He didn't want to go to Palestine. They were searching him for 2-3 days, and they found him and forced him to go to Palestine. I can tell you a family secret. He hated it. He came from Europe to the Middle East, to a city called Jaffa, shooting every day, and definitely not from Zionist reasons. I want a word about my mother. My mother grew up in the same city of Pforzheim, born a year later, 1920. In 1939, or in the end of 38, the Kristallnacht, you remember all synagogues in Germany were attacked. Her parents had no intention to go to Israel, even it was already after the Kristallnacht. But the Nazis captured my grandfather, took him to Dachau, and forced him to leave Israel. But my mother was above 18, she didn't get a certificate, applied for a visa to the United States and refused. And then she escaped to Belgium, from Belgium to France. She was hiding in France for 5-6 years during the whole war, and only after the war, in 1946, disconnected from her parents for 7 years without no contact whatsoever. She came to Israel, they married, and I was born. So this description of Jews who were always motivated by Zionism and came to Israel is very, very partial. My parents were not Zionist. They were refugees. My mother was a Holocaust survivor. And this is a part of the Ashkenazi community in Israel. So maybe we are colonialists, but we were also refugees. I wanted to tell this story because for 35 years, I served this colonialist power. A few years as a soldier, and then as an officer in the army, and over 30 years as a diplomat. But I want to tell you a little bit about the government that I was serving. I was serving a government that extended its hand for peace. Now, it's not that I'm guessing. I joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs very early, when I was 22 years old. And these were the briefings. We want peace. We want peace. We want to be part of the Middle East. We don't want Europe that treated us horribly. And after 1967, obviously, we captured the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Golan Heights, and I continue to serve this colonialist power. But this colonialist power said it is ready to exchange land for peace. Again, I'm not guessing. For 3 years, I was the spokesman of this colonialist government between 1986 and 1990, or 1987 to 1990. And I had the press briefing at noon every day to the international press. And every day we said, we are ready to have 2 states. We are ready to exchange land for peace. And as you know, here and there, we negotiated. It didn't work, but the negotiation was always based on 67 with swap and so on. So this colonialist country was ready to make peace until about 10 years ago. 10 years ago, something quite dramatic happened. We stopped negotiating with the Palestinians. it was mentioned here, Kerry was the last Secretary of State doing this proximity talk between Jerusalem and Ramallah. And the most painful thing for me, who always believed in peace and two states, the government, the coalition agreements removed the term two states from all coalition agreements we had in the last 10 years. And the government started opposing the two states solution. And of course, opposing the establishment of a Palestinian state. So when we discuss Israel, we are speaking on two different Israels. We are speaking on Israel that wanted peace until about 15 years ago, or 10 years ago. We are speaking on Israel whose prime minister was assassinated because he wanted peace. And we are speaking today on Israel that doesn't want peace, that doesn't want two states. Of course, there is a process here, and it's based on elections, and the Israeli public shifted dramatically to the right. Part of it was the second intifada in the years 2001, 2003, and part of it, of course, was the 7th of October last year. And the problem now is that the government is not acting rationally, is acting emotionally, and there is a call, public call, strong public call for revenge. I want now to go to what I planned to speak about. I added this part because really I didn't serve the Israel that we have now. It's a different Israel. And I don't feel that a solution can emerge from the Israeli public, neither from the Palestinian public, that is also acting emotionally. And it has to come from the international community. As Vincent said, we need help. What we saw yesterday night in Biden's speech is part of the pressure on Israel. He was very polite to describe it as an Israeli plan. It's not an Israeli plan. Netanyahu's office already said it's a non-starter. Biden gambled here and put a very reasonable, thoughtful plan in order, I think, to embarrass Netanyahu or force Netanyahu into moving. I don't know if it will be enough. I don't think it will be enough. And more things have to be done simultaneously. A certain diplomatic tsunami already started with the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court asking for orders against Netanyahu and Gallant, the defense minister. But I see that the momentum of recognition of Palestine as the most important game in town. And I want to explain, until the 6th of October, Netanyahu was the magician. Although we didn't have peace talks for 10 years, on the 6th of October, 2023, we were in our best international standing ever. And I'm saying it as somebody who served this government as a diplomat, as an ambassador, and so on, for 35 years. Best diplomatic standing ever on the 6th of October 2023, meaning Israel didn't pay any price for halting the talks and for removing the two states from its agenda, although the international policy continued to be two states. Now, after the war, we are 8 months into this war, things have dramatically changed. There is a U-turn in the international standing of Israel. And here I want to explain what is happening and what is, I think, needed. First of all, the unbelievable amount of casualties in Gaza and in the region, by the way. There are casualties in Lebanon too, and in Syria. And by the way, casualties in Israel also. We have now 125 hostages, but without the hostages, that some of them are killed already. We have 1,550 killed, 1,550 people killed. So definitely, there was a huge, enormous mistake in leading these two sides, Israel and Palestine, to such a catastrophe. The world sees now the pictures in Gaza, sees the destruction in Gaza, sees the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, and punishes Israel. But it doesn't punish Israel only on this. Part of the pressure, part of the criticism is a result of the anger that accumulated toward Israel until the 7th of October because of the occupation, because of the settlements. This anger could not express itself because Israel was a regional power. Nobody wanted to confront Israel. We were at our best. So now there are 3 elements in this tsunami, diplomatic tsunami. The damage to the Palestinians, the casualties on the Palestinian side, the occupation and the settlements, and the removal of the 2 states from the Israeli agenda. And on top of it, just they joined with pleasure, is the anti-Semites that always existed. They are not a majority, definitely not in the modern world, but there is a percentage of the population that is anti-Semite, and they are joining this trend, and Israel is facing now real international difficulties. Some of it earned by its mistakes. Now, I see the issue of the recognition as the most important part of it, because for this government, I'll call it the Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir government, a Palestinian state is a catastrophe, is a disaster. And I don't think it's a disaster, and the world doesn't think it's a disaster. But if we will have a momentum, including Europe, including the countries that Israel cares about and wants to be part of the democratic world, including Australia, including Canada, including New Zealand, including maybe Britain and the United States, then the government is getting a Palestinian state without anyone even asking Israel, which is, again, the worst thing that can happen to this government. And I think the best thing, to my mind, that can happen to this government. By the way, if this momentum will continue, I hope that at a certain point, the Americans will remove the veto on the issue of full membership of Palestine in the UN. And if you have Palestine as a member state in the UN, then we get part of this parity of esteem that Vincent mentioned that is so needed. Because until the 6th of October, we were sure that the government of Israel was sure that it eliminated the Palestinian problem. That we have relations with the Saudis, with the Indonesians, everybody forgot about Palestine. It was so close. And now, if Palestine will be accepted as a member in the UN, this is clarifying to the Israeli government and to the Israeli public that the world is not going to forget the existence of a Palestinian state. And I think it will lead to a lot of thinking inside Israel. I don't want to spend a lot of time on what we call the solution. First of all, because Vincent spoke a lot about it, but mainly because our problem now is not if it will be one state or two states or three states or any other solution. Our problem now is that we cannot enter the same room to negotiate. The Israeli public and the Palestinian public cannot enter the same room. And we need very, very strong international pressure and very, very professional mediation to lead us back to the same room. By the way, it's not such a sensation. Until 10 years ago, for over 20 years, we were in the same room, including myself. I was part of talks here and there. We were always discussing things, even agreeing here and there, although many of the agreements were not kept, but we were in the same room. The challenge now is to push us again to the same room and discuss the future. I'm not using even the word peace. I think it's not only the government in Israel that doesn't use the word peace anymore. The public doesn't use the word peace. People are so disillusioned, and there were so many disappointments in the past that people in the region do not believe in peace. But let's first enter the same room, and if I think we'll have a long enough period in the same room, we will reach several understandings that maybe will revive the wish and the dream of peace in our region.
Thank you, Dr. Leal. It's very sad to know that peace is not considered as a choice, not only for this dialogue, but for many places in the world, in daily life. So it may be our role to bring it back, wherever we are, bring that peace as a choice. So here we go again for 10 minutes of questions and answers. A lot of questions have been submitted, so I will try to be respectful of some of them and cover as much as possible. Otherwise, we will have a few minutes at the end of the session, try to find some questions for all of you, the presenters today, to cover. Amadullah Farad from Egypt asks, how do you suggest to solve expected conflict between having an elected right-wing leadership and a leadership believing in pluralism?
Can you repeat the question? An elected?
How do you suggest to solve expected conflict between having an elected right-wing leadership like Bingber or Hamas and a leadership believing in pluralism?
Look, I think for the foreseeable future, no Israeli can sit in the same room with a Hamas representative. It's unthinkable. I don't know if it will ever happen, but I cannot foresee it happening in the next few years. And the Palestinians will have to be represented by non-Hamas factions, by the PA, Fatah, others that are acceptable to Israel. About Israel, we have an elected leadership. Nobody claims that Netanyahu doesn't have a majority. And it might well happen that if we go again to elections, he will be re-elected. So having elections or an elected leadership doesn't always solve the problem. We have an elected leadership that doesn't want peace. And we have among the Palestinians leadership in the West Bank that was elected 19 years ago and wants peace, or at least says it wants peace. So I think, and I'm repeating what I said, don't count on us. Don't count on the Israelis and don't count on the Palestinians. We cannot do it ourselves. We are traumatized to such a degree that it's impossible to act rationally. So the only side that can bring reason into the picture is the world. And if the world will come in a forceful manner and in an intelligent and sophisticated manner that will explain that it has good intentions and convince that it has good intentions, then we have a chance.
We need strong leaders, in the international community to call for that. So Amit is asking, please speak to the reign of terror by settlers and the IDF against Palestinians in the West Bank, while international attention is preoccupied with the horror in Gaza.
Look, if I understand correctly the question, it speaks about the violence of settlers against Palestinians in the West Bank. It's horrible. Mm-hmm. It is horrible, terrible, terrible. Peter said 750,000 settlers. I think the number is lower, but it doesn't matter. The settlers are running Israel. Many of the ministers are settlers. The political power of the settlers is the reason we cannot speak about peace, is the reason we cannot speak about two states. They are very, very strong politically, and they're growing in numbers. What they do, private settlers to Palestinians, are crimes. And I was very glad to see countries, including the United States, including Britain, including Canada, I think France too, sanctioning individuals that were caught attacking Palestinians. And I think it's very important because it signals to the leadership, that is based on the support of the settlers and is helping the settlers to strengthen themselves. It's signaling that the world will not accept this behavior of settlers toward Palestinians. I think it's important.
Thank you. One more question. We have a couple of minutes. What are your thoughts on another Trump's presidency?
For me, personally, I don't know if I can speak on behalf of how many Israelis, it's a nightmare. What Trump did in his first term was dramatically widening the gap of power between Israel and the Palestinians, especially in the international arena. He moved the American embassy to Jerusalem. He recognized our annexation of the Golan Heights. And he he closed the embassy of the Palestinians in Washington. He closed the consulate of the United States in Jerusalem. And the reason Israel could really fully remove from the agenda the issue of two states and peace and so on was mainly the first term of Trump, because not only that he allowed it, he was with moves that he did, he was benefiting Israel on the international arena in such a way that Israel saw it as an encouragement to drop the issue of peace. So I think that it'll be terrible if he has a second term. Although, unfortunately, Biden, that is thinking correctly, and we saw the speech yesterday, it's a masterpiece. It's a very important move. Cannot force the Israeli government to do anything. And it's very sad to see that the Congress in the United States, the two parties and the two houses, invited Netanyahu to speak in front of the Congress, and he's leaving to the United States to speak there. So even the Biden administration could unfortunately do very little in order to solve the problem, but I don't think Trump is the solution.
I don't think Trump is the solution. I'm in Seattle, Washington. So, well, thank you, everybody. It has been a gift for all of us here, listening to your sharings, your knowledge, your experience. Thank you so much for bringing this awareness, for helping us to acknowledge, the past, the present, and hopefully, our role in the future. So we have a few minutes, and I will invite the three presenters to share any last thoughts before I ask a couple of questions to all of you. So anything to add after you have listened to your colleagues and you have listened also to their responses to the questions that the participants are asking. So please.
Maybe I could speak first, just to say, I admire Peter and I admire Alon, and they speak their truths. I agree with Alon that expecting traumatized people in Israel and war-wounded people in Gaza and in parts of the West Bank to forget and to enter into a negotiation bilaterally is not on the cards. It's unlikely anytime soon. Ironically, what happened on the 7th of October has brought the issue back to the center stage in a violent and brutal way. But it has also distanced the two peoples even more. They were already quite distant. That leaves the role of the international community that Alon spoke of. History says that the Western world does not put pressure on Israel. That is the past. That is what has happened. The diplomatic tsunami that Barak and Alon have spoken of is partly legal through the ICJ and the ICC, and a lot will depend on what the international community, the West, makes of the opinions of those institutions. I don't expect sanctions against Israel by the West. It is clear that Israel's standing international reputation is damaged by the visions of what we see in Gaza. Can recognition help? Yes. Alon is right that the fear of Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir is that Palestine will, in one sense, emulate Israel by achieving international recognition on a unanimous scale. So I don't expect much from Israel or from the Palestinians. I come back to what Westerners can do in those circumstances. Like Alon, I advocate recognition by our government, British, tomorrow, of Palestine. At the moment, the argument is about whether that recognition could be attached to some negotiation. I think Alon has answered that question. Therefore, the pressure should be on our government, on the French, to find a way to create a framework that is reasonable, that is civilized, that does persuade over time, and that is based on self-determination for the two peoples. And recognition should not be a component part of that, should be the instigator of that, should be the starting point. So what France and the UK should do with Australia, with New Zealand, is to kickstart a process which may not involve the two parties directly, but does involve creating a framework of international expectation as to what the outcome should be. And then people of goodwill and reason should come to it.
Thank you, Sir Vincent.
I'm ready to follow up on Vincent. I'll try to be a little bit more accurate on the issue of recognition. I'm quite worried at this stage that the momentum has exhausted itself. We have seen now Spain, Ireland, and Norway, and Slovenia is well into the process, but I don't see the next one. I don't yet see the next country. And I want to remind that Sweden did it in 2014 and stayed the only one in Western Europe and in the EU for 10 years. So I'm worried at this very point that it's Ireland, Norway, Spain, and Slovenia, and the next one will come in 2034. I mean, this will achieve nothing. This will achieve nothing. And I think it's important to work on Britain, especially if the Labour will win now. But I think it's much more important at this stage to work on Belgium, on Malta, and on France. I think that the chance in France is still much bigger than in Britain. But give me anyone. Give me anyone. Give me Australia. This momentum has to continue because it reached a certain peak in the assembly, UN Assembly, of 143 countries voting in favor of a member state. This is 143 from 193. The whole world, the vast majority wants a member state. For how long can America block it? For how long, especially when they are so angry at us? When we are, I don't know if you saw the response of Netanyahu today to Biden's plan. He said it's a non-starter in English, meaning how much can the United States tolerate? coming from Israel. So I really hope that this momentum will have a continuation now in the very near future, immediately after Slovenia. Slovenia, I think, is next week, because if this is coming to an halt, one of the biggest diplomatic assets that the Palestinians are having at the moment, and one of, I think, the key factors for the parity of esteem issue, at least on the diplomatic level, will be lost.
Mm-hmm. Definitely a lot of international responsibility here. And again, we need leadership. Leadership, if somebody put the countries together, then an answer and pressure, would be more possible. So, Dr. Shambrook, any other comments?
I am keeping my fingers crossed. I am keeping my fingers crossed that it is this recognition by European countries and other countries is not going to grind into the sand, is not going to be like water in a desert, but that the momentum will continue. It must continue. It must continue. The only other thing I really feel I should say is that we all weep. We all weep. I do anyway. We all weep at the trauma of Israel being attacked the way it was attacked, and the hostages, and appreciate the trauma of the Israeli population at the moment. I would just say that that 2 million Palestinians in Gaza have been systematically, in a sense, traumatized, since 2007. And even you could say the Palestinians on the West Bank. I mean, any country under occupation or any region under occupation, the population is traumatized. That is a sort of medical, psychological fact. It's not just sort of an opinion. So in the region between the river and the sea, millions of people, everybody is traumatized. And, it's not up to somebody like me to decide who is more traumatized than another. But everybody is traumatized, and it can't go on.
Thank you. We have only 4 minutes before the end of this session. And even when we have plenty of questions, there is one that I cannot pass with this short time. Dennis Nolan asks, can non-governmental agencies like Initiatives for Change play any helpful role in this situation?
I think Alan wanted to speak.
And I think definitely positive. Definitely positive. It is true that the recognition, the tip of the iceberg is the governmental recognition. But we know that the governments are checking around, looking to the sides, which other governments are doing it, and looking into the public. And I think the public should speak out. The public, I think, in the European countries, where Israel has quite a lot of support, should understand that they are not, a recognition of Palestine is not an anti-Israeli move. It's maybe a move against the anti-Netanyahu, against the Netanyahu government, but not an anti-Israeli move. A lot of the Israeli public still supports the two states, even if it's not a majority at the moment, but I'm not sure. Things are changing all the time. And this paranoia, Israeli paranoia from a Palestinian state is only 10 years old. We are 76 years old. For 66 years, Israel, or especially since 67 to 10 years ago, we thought this is the solution. So by doing so, governments are helping to find a solution. not complicating the situation, and definitely not deciding between Palestine and Israel. I see it very much, unlike the issue of sanctions on Israel, that is a negative move toward Israel. Recognition is a positive move, first toward Palestinians and their morale, but also toward Israel, because the only way Israel can be convinced to sit down seriously is if Palestine will be recognized internationally as a state and become a member of the UN.
If I can just add to that, I do believe that British recognition of Palestine can and should, and I think will, be done on the basis that it is for the long-term good of everybody, for Israel as well as for Palestine, because the risk of chronic violence, which we have seen, which Peter chronicled, is ever present, and the risk to the well-being of Palestinians is clear. It's clear from the occupation. The risk to the well-being of Israelis from the absence of security, the failure of security, and of the economic consequences, not sanctions, but individual company decisions on investment or not from outside Israel. Those are factors which will affect the employability in Israel and will affect tourism and will affect many things. So the physical and, if you like, mental well-being of Israelis and Palestinians in the long term, I think, will be helped by this issue of self-determination. And therefore, as Alon said, recognition is not a punishment of Israel. It is a kind of calling to order, if you like, to go back to the idea of land for peace, which has been lost, but can come back, and to enable the international community to do that. Organizations like IOFC, like the Balfour Project, like the policy working group that Alon is involved with heavily, can make their presence felt, can advocate, can persuade, can come together to work on their respective audiences.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Shambrook, Dr. Liel, and Sir Vincent, for your time today. Again, time is running out. Many of the questions also in the chat have been answered with all your comments. Now I want to give a few minutes to Munir, that he wants to introduce us to the next session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maria del Pilar Griffin, for your excellent moderation. Thank you, dear guest speakers, for your outstanding sharing and honest conversation. Thank you, dear participants, for joining and supporting Voices of Justice and Peace. Thank you, United for Humanity Group members who actively supported the preparation of this conference. Thank you, our dream team working behind the scenes: Alina, Diana, Hidayah, Igor, Ismar, Jean-Louis, John, Marwa, Monder, Rebecca, Rodrigo, and all those who contributed. Thank you all for being on the right side of history. This is the beginning of a constructive conversation towards justice and peace in the Middle East. Let's not leave all the media space to propaganda. There is no space for humanity without peace for Palestinians. There is no peace for humanity without peace for Palestinians and Israelis. Same causes are more likely to produce same consequences everywhere. Let's address the root causes with justice and fairness. One quick word about Gaza relief support. In Gaza, famine is setting in, and those who have managed to flee to Egypt have lost everything. IOFC International is collecting funds through our website for those who are in the greatest need and who we can reach. This aid is a lifeline for many. Every donation matters. Next session is planned in a few minutes, probably 27 minutes from now, with Professor Ilan Pape, Mrs. Sabrine Abdel Allah, and Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Have a short break, and you are most welcome to join again with the same link. Bye for now.
See you in 30 minutes.